Mothers in cults who kill their children often share common themes, such as deep entrenchment in extreme belief systems, susceptibility to manipulation, and an overriding sense of mission or righteousness. When these women are found guilty of murder, my question becomes, what happens to the cult leader who espoused the zealous doctrine that the women followed, they took to heart, and used as motivation for murder? Let's talk about a couple of murder cases where mothers murdered their children. Hey, thanks for joining us here at Profiling Evil. Please take a moment, hit that like and subscribe button. Give us some thumbs up, hit your notifications, ring the bell, do everything that you need, and please consider sharing Profiling Evil with your friends. You can simply copy the links to this video and share it out on your social media. We really appreciate your support. Now, tonight we're talking about mothers who kill their children and the fact that they often share common themes, such as this deep entrenchment in extreme belief systems. They have a susceptibility to manipulation and an overriding sense of mission or righteousness. Tonight I want to concentrate on cases like Chloe Driver, who was just convicted of murder down in Georgia, and Lori Vallow Daybell, who was convicted of murder in Idaho and faces murder charges for her husband in Arizona right now. In each of these cases, there are significant differences in motivation, context, and some of the psychological dynamics. And I want to just compare the two for a few minutes in a couple of areas. Number one, in background and belief. So first we'll talk about Chloe Driver. She was associated with a small cult-like group in Georgia who had, well, actually not in Georgia, but they traveled through Georgia with apocalyptic or spiritual leanings. And you'll remember even weird things like drinking urine. Now, reportedly, she was acting under the influence of cult leaders, a guy named Z, who she says, and the defense says, encouraged extreme forms of discipline and sacrifices for the greater good. Now, Driver's environment was highly controlled, and she was manipulated into believing that harming her children served some kind of a divine purpose. Do you remember the evidence that came out that talked about even breastfeeding? She felt like she was pouring evil into little 18-month-old Hannah. Now, on the flip side, Lori Vallow, also deeply immersed in her doctrine, which happened to be, in her case, a doomsday doctrine focused on beliefs that Chad Daybell was a prophet. Remember him? He was her fifth husband. She was influenced by a blend of apocalyptic and extreme religious ideologies and had a much larger group of like-minded believers hanging around with them. Lori Vallow Daybell saw her children, Tylee and JJ, and her new husband's wife, Tammy, as obstacles, dark spirits that needed to be eliminated for spiritual salvation, or more importantly, in fulfillment of the prophecy she gave that they would die at young ages. The second thing I want to do in kind of comparing the two is talk about the psychological and social dynamics from my perspective. I'm not a psychologist. Chloe Driver first. She was likely, in my opinion, a follower within the cult's hierarchy, driven by coercion and external pressure from the leaders, in particular, probably Z, this man she was kind of married to. To many, her actions appeared less premeditated and more influenced by the immediate control of the group and people within the group. And you'll see why I say to others, because I have a little differing opinion. She probably had limited resources, limited connections, and limited avenues for independent thought, but she did have avenues to escape and didn't take advantage of them. Lori Vallow Daybell, on the other hand, she played a much more autonomous and central role in carrying out this religious doomsday doctrine. She showed signs of narcissism and delusional thinking, seeing herself as the chosen one. And keep in mind, Chloe thought she could read people's minds too, so I guess it kind of goes across both. But working in conjunction with Chad Daybell, it appeared that there was a leadership partnership that was built. And that partnership said that the victimization was okay. She, while she says was influenced by her dominant role in the ideology, she chose to do those things, as did Chloe Driver. The third area I wanted to compare is the role of the children in the belief systems. So first, let's talk about Chloe Driver again. Her child may have been viewed as a sacrificial lamb of sorts, or a target in this thing due to the perceived imperfections that she was feeling as a mother. Again, remember the breastfeeding comment. Or it could have been part of a ritualistic directive from cult leaders. There's so much that we just don't know about this. She likely acted out of fear of punishment or a warped sense of obligation to the group. We know that she acted out for a number of other reasons that came out, like trying to get control of getting her self-proclaimed husband back and other kinds of things. And of course, I'm going to share a couple of thoughts I have on the motivation for the murder at the end, but we'll go forward from here. Lori Daybell, on the other hand, she explicitly labeled her children as dark spirits. She labeled Tammy as a dark spirit and believed that their deaths were necessary to bring about a prophesied event, which happened to be her prophecies. Now, her killings were more strategic, and they aligned with the interpretation she had of religious texts and her doomsday predictions. As we think about the level of violence and planning in the two cases, Chloe Driver, people are saying that the act was less premeditated and more of a reactive kind of a thing, possibly under immediate pressure she was feeling from the cult environment. The violence, in many people's opinion, was part of a direct or immediate response to group doctrine. Others say it was just to get her husband back. Or, in some cases, some people say it was because she may have even viewed herself as an angel of mercy. Lori Vallow Daybell, on the other hand, the murders were highly premeditated. They involved planning, concealment, and coordination with Chad Daybell and Alex Cox. The effort to hide the children's deaths and present some kind of a facade of normalcy indicated this calculated approach. I mean, they even went to Hawaii and got married while their children were missing, or her children were missing. The fifth kind of thing I want to do as a quick comparison is the accountability and legal outcomes of the two. For Chloe Driver, in this trial, while the prosecution tried to portray her as a predator, the defense portrayed her as a victim of the cult, manipulated by the cult. The courts, I think, took that into consideration, and especially the jury, and they used that as a way to kind of understand or make sense of her actions, although it didn't absolve her of responsibility. Remember, she was found guilty of murder, but found mentally ill. Lori Vallow, on the other hand, convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. She was portrayed as manipulative, and she was portrayed as an active participant in the killings, even though she may not have pulled the trigger, so to speak, and that her personal and ideological motives were behind this 100%. I joined Vinnie Politan on Court TV to talk about the issue of mothers in cults who kill their children. Vinnie's question was pretty darn direct when he asked about whether I believe a cult leader should be charged in crimes like this, crimes like the Chloe Driver case, or others that are similar. Let's watch.
Guilty, all counts, but mentally ill. An acknowledgement by the jury that this young mother who killed her baby, who murdered her baby, is suffering from mental illness and was suffering from mental illness at the time that she murdered her baby. Mental illness, part of a polygamous cult. Suffering from mental illness, but part of a cult. And that brings me to my next question about what happened here to that child. What about the cult leader? She's found guilty but mentally ill. But how about the man who is leading her in this cult while she's mentally ill? Joining me to help figure all of this out, retired police commander, religious cult expert, host of the podcast Profiling Evil, and the author of the book Deceived. Mike King is with us. Also with us, psychotherapist, CEO of Life Counseling Solutions, Dr. Janie Lacey. Great to have you both here. Let me start with you, Mike, and your thoughts about the cult leader. What about the cult leader and the death, the murder of this child by a member of his cult who's mentally ill?
You know, Vinny, I've shared with you many times, my concern has always been more about those who are number 2 and 3 down the rung in these cult organizations than these self-proclaimed prophets who say, hey, I'm the voice of God, but you're lucky enough to be the arm of God or the one that gets to act out these things. So I think there needs to be a whole lot more investigation done into what that relationship was, what the ideology was, what the methodology was of how you cleanse yourself when you're out of sync with the group, because we know that cults will love bomb you in, but when you disagree, they do the exact opposite, and they shun you and push you away until you come back in line. I think a lot about things like the Crumbly case and the fact that his parents ended up getting charged for things that he did. And I wonder if those things are still in reach in cases like this, because that cult leader certainly creates a mindset that people want to show obedience to.
And since we were talking about Chloe Driver, we shifted right over to Lori Daybell, whose trial is coming up, and she was in a hearing that she was talking about her mental stability. I had this response.
All right, Mike King. Obviously, there's some mental issues with Lori Daybell. We've known that. There was no insanity defense. It doesn't really exist in Idaho for her trials. But it's clearly an issue in her life. Her cult leader, Chad Daybell, was prosecuted for the murders, even though he didn't necessarily physically do them himself. She's suffering from some mental issues. He's the leader. He's never claimed any mental issues. He was never found incompetent. How do you see that case in terms of looking at this cult leader versus Chloe Driver's cult leader?
Well, I look at them kind of entirely in separate buckets, Vinny, because as I watch Lori Daybell again, it's like she's in a job interview and she's trying to prove that she is competent, that she's aware of what's going on, but most importantly, that she's inspired by the God that she believes in, and that God told her to be a part of all of this, whether she took a part in the physical action or the conspiracy aspect, it doesn't matter. But to her, it's proving that I still am right, I still did the right thing, and I'm following this God that I believe in. Chloe, I think, is a little bit different because she was going through some not only feelings of paranoia as they separate them, they go through this process called search and separate, where they pull them away from everything that's positive in their life and break them down so that they give in and go along. And she was not only paranoid, but she was depressed, and she was afraid her whole life was collapsing around her. She still knew what was right and wrong, and she still chose to kill that little baby, but she was making choices on her own, but she was doing it in a really compromised emotional state, in my opinion.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you, Mike.
Well, in my opinion, both mothers were influenced by cult dynamics and extreme beliefs, but they chose to commit murder anyway. Lori Daybell's case stood out for its premeditated, ideologically driven nature of this whole thing, and the fact that her position was a key leader in the group. Now, in contrast, Chloe Driver's actions seem to stem from some external coercion, maybe even internal coercion, and the immediate pressure of cult leadership. Nonetheless, in my opinion, Hannah Driver's murder was premeditated by her mother, Chloe. And I say that because I take into account the internet searches that came out in trial, the conflicts she was having with her distorted beliefs that came out in trial, the physical act of going downstairs and retrieving a knife from the kitchen, hiding it, going back upstairs into the bedroom with her 18-month-old child, locking the door, and then committing the homicide. All speaks to premeditation. These distinctions highlight the varied pathways through which cult dynamics can distort maternal instinct and lead to tragic outcomes. I would like to think that Chloe Driver and even Lori Vallow Daybell could have been a good mother had they not been a predator. But what about holding the cult leader responsible? This person who's espousing bizarre doctrine, claiming it to be religious and righteous, shouldn't they be held accountable? You know, I believe that it is important to hold cult leaders accountable for their violent rhetoric. I think it's a moral and legal imperative. Cult leaders wield immense influence over their followers. They often exploit their vulnerabilities and they shape their beliefs to fit the cult leaders' apocalyptic and extreme narratives. When their bizarre behaviors and violent rhetoric lead to real-world harm, there are injuries, deaths, and other atrocities. And it raises this critical question that I think we all have, and that is, shouldn't these leaders be legally accountable for the words that they espouse? In my opinion, the answer is a resounding yes. Cult leaders often act with calculated intent, knowing that their rhetoric can provoke extreme behavior. They carefully craft ideology that blurs the line between loyalty and obedience, embedding violent directives under the guise of spiritual salvation or divine will. This manipulation, coupled with isolation from external influences, separating them from their safety net of family and friends, creates a dangerous cocktail of coercion and moral detachment in the followers of these cult leaders. Our legal system, however, frequently struggles to connect the dots between the speech and the violence, and leaders often shield themselves under claims of free speech, or they disclaim direct responsibility for the actions of their followers. But there are precedents out there that exist. Charges of incitement, conspiracy, and even murder can and should be applied when the rhetoric crosses into provocation. The impact of cults, such as those led by people like Jim Jones or David Koresh, maybe more recently Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow Daybell, illustrate the catastrophic consequence of unchecked influence. The rhetoric of these leaders in these cases is not just abstract or theoretical. In the cases we've been talking about, it was explicit or an implied call to action, in my opinion. For those people harmed, whether through death, abuse, or psychological devastation, justice demands accountability at all levels. Not only the person who pulled the trigger, but the one who said you should pull the trigger. In fact, I'd like to mention a conversation I had with Dan Lafferty, a man accused of murdering a woman and her baby. Lafferty believed that his brother was a prophet of whatever God they believed in. His brother said he was the voice of God, and he told Dan he was the arm of God, or the one to actually commit the murders. They committed the murders and both were convicted, and both will likely die in prison. Dan will die in prison. His brother Ron has already died in prison. But to hold cult leaders responsible, society has to strengthen the legal frameworks that address incitement and coercion while respecting the balance of free speech. More importantly, awareness and education about cult dynamics can help prevent vulnerable individuals from falling prey to these destructive ideologies from the very get-go. In the end, the harm caused by such rhetoric is not just the responsibility of the perpetrator who pulls the trigger, but of those who planted the seeds of violence in their minds. So how do prosecutors charge cult leaders with murder, for instance, when a follower actually committed the act of murder, but perhaps did so under the influence of the leader's dialogue? We're going to explore some of those complex legal and ethical challenges involved in holding the cult leaders responsible for the rest of this video. From proving intent and causation to navigating constitutional protections like freedom of speech or the freedom to worship as you please, we're going to dive into some of these intricacies of some high-stake cases we've looked at already. We're going to try to discover some of the key legal theories, the evidence required, and we'll maybe touch on some famous precedents from cases like the Charles Manson family case or Nixium, and talk about how those shaped into prosecutions. You know, it's deeply unsettling to witness murder trials where cult members, seemingly under the influence of coercive and charismatic leaders, commit violent crimes. It's universally accepted that the person who physically committed the crime must face justice. But many of us are out here scratching our head and wondering, why aren't the leaders who espouse the doctrine, the illegal behavior, and the destructive ideologies also held accountable? This dilemma becomes especially challenging when there are no explicit conspiratorial instructions tying the leader to the crime. Yet the association, the doctrine, and the ideology all promote unmistakable fuel to the criminal fire. These cases force us to confront the boundaries of accountability, free will, and the consequences of unchecked influences. So I want to start out by looking at some of the challenges prosecutors face in going after cult leaders. Again, keep in mind, going after a cult leader has significant ethical and legal challenges, and these cases require prosecutors to kind of navigate complex evidentiary requirements, legal doctrines, and society's perceptions of personal accountability versus group influence in these kinds of crimes. Our task is kind of further complicated by the need to demonstrate intent, causation, and the culpability in a framework where cult leaders may not have directly committed the crime, but they might have influenced it. So first, we got to talk about the legal framework. In most jurisdictions, murder charges hinge on the concept of mens rea, criminal intent, or on actus reus, the criminal act. In cases where cult members commit murder, the prosecutor must establish a direct connection between the leader's influence, teachings, or directives, and the unlawful killing of someone. So we got to hit on two legal theories that are often employed. Number one, aiding and abetting. Under this theory, the prosecutor must prove that the cult leader actively encouraged or facilitated the crime. This requires showing a level of involvement that goes beyond just ideological influence to actually tangible kinds of actions. The second big thing is conspiracy. The prosecutor has to be able to prove that the leader and the cult member conspired to commit the murder. The leader might be held responsible even if they didn't directly participate in the killing if they can show that link. Conspiracy charges require that evidence of an agreement to commit a murder in this case and an overt act happen in furtherance of that agreement. So the challenges in the criminal prosecution become, pretty lengthy. I think we'll talk about 5 or 6 of them here. First is proving causation. One of the most significant challenges of establishing a direct causal link between the cult leader's influence and the member's criminal actions are really important here. Now, defense attorneys are going to argue that the follower acted independently without the leader's blessing on this thing. They misinterpreted the leader's teaching. And without explicit instructions from the leader to the member to commit the murder, it becomes really difficult to prove causation beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution must demonstrate that the leader intended for their teachings or their actions to result in criminal activity. Again, we're talking about murder in this case. This requires proving that the leader's state of mind and knowledge of the probable consequences of their directives would lead to murder, and that they didn't stop it. Number three, we gotta think about First Amendment considerations, because cult leaders have a right to free speech and freedom of religion. Prosecutors have to carefully navigate those constitutional protections and avoid infringing on legitimate expressions of beliefs, even if those beliefs are extreme or controversial to people like you and me. And number four, you have to deal with the fact that there's not a lot of direct evidence in these cases. Cult leaders rarely leave behind explicit orders to commit violent acts. Instead, their influence is often exerted through indirect means, like the sermons that they give, their writings, or personal conversations. So prosecutors have to piece together a circumstantial evidence case to prove the leader's intent and connect them directly to the crime. You got to consider the fact that the defense is going to say, hey, the leader didn't mean for this to happen, and this person may have been brainwashed by the cult membership, that they may have been acting under duress or diminished capacity. And we have to be able to say that it was happening, those things were happening under the leader's influence. This can shift the focus of the trial to a psychological state of the follower, making it a whole lot harder to hold the leader accountable. And in both Daybell and Driver's case, we saw it move to this psychological angle. The evidence has to tie the cult leader to the crime. So I want to talk about a couple of those first. Explicit directives. Be written, audio, or video evidence showing that the leader instructed the member to commit the crime, that if you want the strongest form of evidence. Now, that's not absolutely required, but that would be awesome. You have to have a pattern of behavior, evidence that previous criminal acts committed by cult members under the leader's influence establish a pattern of culpability in the cult. You look for things like witness testimonies. We saw this in the Driver case. Testimony from former members or insiders who can attest to the leader's influence, their coercive tactics, or direct involvement in planning crimes. That has to be critically involved in this thing. And then you're going to have the psychological evaluations, where the expert testimony about the leader's psychological manipulation tactics can demonstrate intent and causation. You got to always consider cultural and ideological kinds of documents too. The leader's sermons, their literature, or other materials that might promote violence can serve as evidence of the leader's intent that a violent act to happen in these things. These things get kind of tricky, and there has to be ethical considerations like the autonomy of cult members. The prosecution has to respect the autonomy of cult members, even if they're acting under influence. In this case, Chloe still knew what was right and wrong, and she chose to commit the murder anyway. This raises ethical questions about how much responsibility can be assigned to the follower versus the leader. As we talk about religious freedom, we have to avoid stigmatizing legitimate religious or spiritual practices, ensuring that the case doesn't become a trial against a belief system, but rather it is a trial against criminal conduct. This is an area where I've spent a lot of time over the course of my career teaching law enforcement to focus on the elements of the crime first. and then bring in the religious influence and what it had to play in the overall picture. You got to think about the fact of public's perception, our perception, and our biases. There are risks that there are biases against unconventional religious or spiritual groups, and that bias could unfairly influence the trial. The prosecutor's job is to ensure that the case is based on facts and legal principles, not prejudices. Now, if a criminal case doesn't work out, there is a possibility that a cult leader could face civil litigation, a different avenue. You know, in cases where criminal charges fail or they're not pursued, victims' families can seek justice through civil litigation. Civil cases have a lower burden of proof, requiring a preponderance of evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This is going to be something that opens the door to holding cult leaders accountable for their actions in a completely different framework. So if this thing were to move and we were to look at cases where cult leaders are charged civilly, we could see a couple of key considerations pop up. Number one, vicarious liability, because the plaintiffs are going to have to argue that the cult leader is liable for the actions of the follower, especially if the crime occurred as a foreseeable result of the leader's influence. The leader kept saying, do this, and the follower did it. Number two, that there was negligence. A civil suit might claim that the cult leader was negligent in their teachings, or that they failed to prevent foreseeable harm caused by their ideology, that they didn't say, don't do these kind of things. Families of victims might pursue claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, particularly if the cult leader's actions contributed to the harm. But the evidence becomes the real challenge in these cases. The same type of evidence is used in criminal cases and civil cases. But remember, there's a much lower standard of proof in civil cases. It allows much broader interpretations. So things like financial records, membership agreements, all of those things could be scrutinized to show a pattern of exploitation or harm. So even in a civil court, you have to take into account some real ethical things to consider. There's a risk that focusing exclusively on monetary damages in a civil case rather than justice might undermine the victim's quest for accountability in the case. Have to also consider that cult leaders often have substantial resources, creating a pretty unfair imbalance in the legal fight. It is absolutely important that we ensure a fair representation for plaintiffs and defendants in these kinds of cases. And in this case of Chloe Driver, I don't think there's a lot of money involved in the organization. But in some cults that we've talked about, there's huge money involved in those things. You know, these kind of cases can take into account case studies that have been done on previous incidents, like the Manson family case. One of the most notable cases, in my opinion, Charles Manson was convicted of murder despite not committing the killings himself. Now, prosecutors in that case successfully argued that Manson's ideological influence and his explicit instructions to those who followed him made him culpable for murder, just like those who committed the murders. Heaven's Gate is always kind of a little tricky in my opinion. A mass suicide occurred. There were no criminal charges, but the leadership role and those who survived could have been the subject of some public and civil scrutiny, but they never were. In modern cases like Nexium, for instance, Keith Raniere, it highlighted the coercion, manipulation, and influence that these cults can have. And that one happened to result in legal repercussions for the leaders, Raniere. He even went to jail on the criminal side and got hammered civilly. This is not always in the context of murder, though. So charging a cult leader is difficult, but possible if we can prove those relationships in there. Charging a cult leader with murder, for instance, is really fraught with legal and ethical complexities. The prosecution has to carefully balance the principles of individual accountability, the person who pulled the trigger, for instance, and the voice that said you should pull the trigger. By leveraging evidence of intent, causation, and a pattern of coercive behavior, prosecutors can build cases that hold leaders accountable while respecting constitutional protections and ethical considerations. So ultimately, these cases not only challenge society's understanding of free will, autonomy, and responsibility, but it makes these cases some of the most intricate and consequential legal battles in the justice system. And that's exactly what I think the case of Chloe Driver will become, is a case that really lays out whether someone can be guilty of a crime but mentally ill. It's going to be interesting to watch. And I'd like to know your comments, and I hope you'll put them down below. And while you're commenting, I hope you'll take time to read each other's comments and make comments on their comments. Be kind to one another, and let's learn together. And remember, folks, that you can find Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you like audio podcasts, I hope you're checking out Profiling Evil audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. Remember to go over to profilingevil.com and check out our story maps and our missing persons and unsolved murders public sourced map, a place where you can enter cases from your own community anywhere in the world and take part in keeping the word out in front of everyone else. And with the holidays rapidly approaching, make sure you check out my books. My two favorites that I have on the website are Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult, and She Knew No Fear. Now, Deceived is about the investigation and ultimate takedown of a cult that I broke up many years ago, rescuing 32 children. The book focuses on the kids that recovered from this system. It focuses on the dynamics of cult recruiting, how cult leaders keep people involved in the cult, and how cult leaders can somehow take seemingly intelligent people and in some cases turn them into predatory criminals. I think you'd enjoy what you can learn from Deceived, and I want you to know that proceeds from that book are going to build a new children's advocacy center, a place where kids can be forensically and physically examined as they're prepared for the criminal justice system. This building is going to open up in the spring, and you can see from imagery of that I flew with my drone a few days ago that it is close to completion, and we are very excited and thank each of you for contributing. If you've read Deceived, consider buying it as a gift for someone for Christmas. And consider She Knew No Fear. It's the story of Jane McKechnie Walton, who traveled from her native Scotland across the Atlantic Ocean, walking the plains of America, and eventually becoming part of a group of pioneers who went down through Hole in the Rock. She eventually fought Native American warriors, and on the 24th of July in 1899 was murdered at a town celebration. She happens to be my great-great-grandmother, and 130 years later, I solved her murder. I think you'd enjoy this book, and you'd enjoy her story. So check them both out. And if you live in the United States, I'll ship the book to you for free. And if you buy it through Profiling Evil, I'll even sign it as part of the holiday gift giving. Hey, thanks for your support of Profiling Evil. Remember that you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And make sure you're subscribing, folks. We'll see you soon.